This is the story of politicians' greed, corruption, fraud, and the belief that he was untouchable. Now, the greed and corruption of Secretary of the Interior Albert Bacon Falls finally caught up with him. He began serving his one-year prison sentence on July 20th, 1931, 8 years after he resigned his post amid allegations of fraud and bribery. He was the first member of a president's cabinet to be convicted and sentenced to prison. But he won't be the last, trust me. So what did Fall do that brought the weight of the U.S. Justice Department crashing down on top of him? 2 words: Teapot Dome, and Fall's belief he was untouchable. You know, it's interesting how once people get power, they think they're untouchable. They're supposed to be the best and the brightest we have to serve. Yeah, right. Okay. Now, if you look in any high school U.S. history textbook, you'll see one paragraph devoted to Teapot Dome. It doesn't even touch the surface of what happened. And the funny thing is, it's still happening today. Just change the name from Teapot Dome to any major scandal in Washington today, and it's the same story. Bribery, undue pressure, influence peddling, biased media, it's all there. Only the names of the actors have been changed. So, what was Teapot Dome and who was Albert Falls? Well, got to go back a little bit on this one, so bear with me. Albert Bacon Falls' rise up the political ladder of success began in 1891 when he was admitted to the bar. He served in New Mexico House of Representatives from 1891 to 1892. He then served on the Territorial Council from 1892 until 1893. Fall was appointed judge of the 3rd Judicial District in 1893 and Associate Justice of the New Mexico Supreme Court later the same year. Fall served on the Territorial Council again from 1896 to 1897 and as the Territory's Attorney General in 1897. He again served on the Territorial Council from 1902 to 1904. He served as Attorney General again from 1907 to 1910. He was a delegate to the Territorial Constitutional Convention. Now, Falls had paid his political dues in the Democratic Party, and he was trusted throughout the territory. Now, it was during the 1890s, though, that Fall began to acquire land in New Mexico territory. During this period, he met and became friends with Oliver Lee, a horse trader and cattle breeder. Depending on which biography you use from Wikipedia, Lee was an honest, ethical man who believed in fair play, or he was a cattle rustler who ran afoul of a man named Albert Jennings Fountain, a local political powerhouse in the Republican Party in the territory, who also raised cattle and horses, among other things. The path of these two men, and by association Albert Fall, were on a collision course, and the inevitable happened. February 1st, 1896. Fountain and his son were returning from Lincoln, where Fountain had been assisting the prosecution in bringing charges against Lee and his associate William McNew. All that was found, though, at the site of the disappearance were Fountain's buckboard wagon, several empty cartridge cases, his cravat, and papers, and 2 pools of blood. The only sign of Henry, his son, was a blood-soaked handkerchief with 2 powder-blackened coins, and the handkerchief still carefully knotted in one corner. Missing were the victims' bodies, a blanket, a quilt, and Fountain's Winchester rifle. Now, Lee and McNew were charged with murder. Since there was no love lost between Albert Falls and Albert Fountain, Falls took the case of his friend. The article written by J.W. Sharp titled Albert Jennings Fountain, the Infamous Fountain Murder, posted on the website desertusa.com, stated, fired by a towering ambition that would propel him to regional and national prominence, Falls soon became the crafty leader and lawyer for the equally ambitious Lee and his hired gunfighter. He hated Albert Jennings Fountain, finding him exceedingly obnoxious to myself. This was according to a quote cited by M. Gibbons in the Life and Death of Colonel Albert Jennings Fountain. The article also stated that Albert Fall screamed that the whole deal was political, that the Republicans were using Fountain's issue to crucify innocent Democrats. In a legal charade orchestrated by Albert Fall, McNew won his release. Lee and Gillard, defended in their trial by Fall, won not guilty verdicts. The gallery, said Gibson, cheered wildly. Now, evidence at the trial suggested Lee was involved in Fountain's murder and disappearance, but the investigators had to deal with a corrupt court system and Fall's legal skills. The body of Fountain and his son and their horses were never found, which hampered the prosecution. The charges against McNew were dismissed by the court, while Lee and Yelland were acquitted. Now again, depending on the source you use, some sources have Alfred Fountain as the local bad actor persecuting honest, hard-working cattlemen who were threatening his control over Lincoln County. Now, I'm not even going to try to sort that one out. The fact remains, after the Fountain case, Albert Fall's star was on the rise. Fall had worked his way up through the Democratic political system, but an interesting thing happened around 1904. He started looking at the Republican Party. So why was he looking at the Republican Party? Well, his law practice revolved around corporate interests. Fall represented irrigation development projects, which have been backed by major financial interests, as well as mining companies, timber companies, railroad companies, and rounding off his client lists were major industrial interests, all Republican. His clientele would have been in the boardrooms of industry and finance, not the back rooms of the Workingmen's Union Hall. Because of his championing of the private enterprise, Fall was seen as a corporate man. He called himself a Democrat, but in reality, he held the political beliefs of a Republican. Fall's pro-private enterprise, pro-business attitude, and his admiration for Theodore Roosevelt made the shift to the Republican Party only natural. He officially came out as a Republican in 1908, when he was a delegate to the National Convention. Now, on January 6, 1912, the United States Congress admitted New Mexico as the 47th state of the Union. Fall was in a position to take one of the two newly opened seats in the United States Senate. Even though he had not paid his political dues as far as the local Republican Party was concerned, he had the ability to make friends in the right places. So, why was Fall able to rely on friends to get one of the two new Senate seats? Well, before 1913 and the adoption of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, that is where they allowed for the direct election by the people of their senators. Each state's two senators were elected by individual state legislatures. And you guessed it, in 1912, New Mexico state legislature was controlled by the Republicans in both houses. One Senate seat was given to Republican Thomas B. Catron, a power broker of the New Mexico Republican Party and the alleged head of the so-called Santa Fe Ring. And this was a group of powerful attorneys and land speculators who amassed a fortune through political corruption and fraudulent land deals. Now, it was through Catron's influence that Falls, who by this time had become a close friend of Catron's, was selected to be the other senator from New Mexico. Now, once in Washington, Falls began cultivating friendships with powerful Republicans, such as Warren G. Harding and his Ohio gang. Now, he did this through the Foreign Relations Committee. He and Harding were on that committee. They became friendly, and Fall started playing poker regularly with Harding and his infamous Ohio gang. Now, even though Harding came into the Senate 2 years after Fall, he was considered by many in the Republican Party as a reliable conservative who would vote the right way. Harding's Ohio gang were a group of political hacks and sycophants out for themselves, though. They saw Harding as a decent, kind person whose gift for being friendly and a backslabber were well known throughout Washington. They hooked their wagons to that political star. Now, it was only natural for Senator Fall to become one of Senator Harding's poker-playing buddies, and it was through these poker games that Fall would ingratiate himself to Harding and the other members of the Ohio gang. Now, this network would lead to Senator Fall becoming Secretary of the Interior in President Harding's cabinet. Now, upon his appointment, he would control all publicly owned federal land and all the mineral rights on that land. Fall believed that all natural resources should be developed and used in his new position. He had the power to do just that. Now, Secretary Fall must have thought he hit the jackpot. The opportunities to line his pockets at public expense were endless. Now, it's interesting to see how a person with political power can justify their corrupt practices. They convince themselves that what they're doing to enrich themselves is also good for their country, thereby making it acceptable practice, and in their minds, perfectly legal. Yeah, right. Or they believe they are so powerful that and important and know more than the average citizen that anything they do in the name of the country is acceptable, whether it's legal or not. They know what is best for the American people. In this instance, they look at the American people as stupid. I hate to say it, That was just said recently by one of our leaders in this present time about understanding the supply chain. But I'm not going to get into that. No way. Okay, so basically, politicians like Fall believe doesn't matter if it's legal or not. If it's good for them and lines their own pocket, then it's going to be good for America. Now, in this instance, it was the sale of oil, or rather the sale of oil owned by the American people, and he did it without their consent. We have a thing called, at that time, we had a thing called the Strategic Naval Oil Reserve, forerunner to the SPR, Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Now, this was begun during President Taft's administration. The U.S. Navy was transitioning from coal-fired steam engines to oil-fired steam turbine engines. Concerned over the long-term availability of petroleum for the U.S. Navy, Taft began designating oil-producing regions of the country as naval petroleum reserves under the control of the Navy Department. In 1915, during Wilson's administration, the Teapot Dome oil field was designated Naval Petroleum Reserve No. 3. Two of the major oil barons of the day, Edward Doheny of Pan American Petroleum and Transport Company and Harry Sinclair of Sinclair Oil, were determined to get their hands on the naval oil reserves. The major oil barons contributed significantly to Harding's presidential campaign with the view that if Harding won the election, he would marginalize the growing conservation movement and overturn the conservation policies of the early administrations, which were blocking their ability to drill for oil. Now, Harding appointed Doheny's old pal, Fall, as the Secretary of the Interior. Doheny had the inside track for the oil concessions. Now, Fall, realizing he had a moneymaker here, once he was ensconced in the position of Secretary of the Interior, he wasted no time in doing what he did best, lining his own pockets through corruption, influence peddling. The problem was the oil was not being produced. It was under the control of the Navy Department as part of the Strategic Naval Oil Reserve Program. All Fall had to do was get control of the Navy Oil Reserve, and he could then do with it what he wanted, in the best interest of the American people, of course. The only person who could transfer control of the Naval Petroleum Reserve was President Harding. Fall just could not go into the Oval Office, though, and ask the President to sign over control of the reserves. He'd need support to justify the request, and that support came from Edward Denby, the Secretary of the Navy. Fall's plan was to convince the Secretary of the Navy the reserves were threatened by privately owned oil wells that were draining the Navy's oil. Now, granting a single lease to pump the oil reserve, Fall argued, was the most efficient way of saving it. Denby, for whatever reason, agreed with Fall's logic and gave his okay for the transfer. With Denby on board, it was just a matter of having President Harding write an executive order authorizing the transfer. Now, at this point, I'm not going to say Harding was incompetent, but he had a lot of friends who were corrupt, and I don't think he really looked into a lot of these things that his appointees were doing. But on May 31st, 1921, Harding issued Executive Order number 3474 under the provision of the Act of Congress approved February 25th, 1920, authorizing the Secretary of the Interior to lease producing oil wells within any naval petroleum reserve, authorizing the President to permit the drilling of the additional wells or to lease the remainder of any part of a claim upon which wells have been drilled, and under authority of the Act of Congress, which was approved June 4th, 1920, and directing the Secretary of the Navy to conserve, develop, use, and operate directly or by contract lease otherwise unappropriated lands in naval reserves, the administration and conservation of oil and gas-bearing lands in Naval Petroleum Reserves number 1 and 2 in California, and Naval Petroleum Reserves number 3 in Wyoming, and the Naval Shale Reserves in Colorado and Utah, and hereby committed to the Secretary of the Interior, subject to the supervision of the President, but no general policy as to drilling or reserving lands located within the Naval Reserve shall be changed or adopted except upon consultation and cooperation with the Secretary or Acting Secretary of the Navy. Secretary of the Interior is authorized to direct to perform any and all acts necessary for the protection, conservation, and administration of the said reserve, subject to the conditions and limitations contained in this order and of the existing laws of such laws as may hereby be enacted by Congress pertaining thereto. Yeah, that is a mouthful to say, but in essence, Falls hit the jackpot. He not only had Teapot Dome, he had the California Naval Reserves and the shale oil. He was going to milk this for every penny and dime he had. Now, Warren G. Harding signed that at the White House May 31st, 1921. With the signing of that executive order, Secretary Falls now had the full backing of law to lease the naval oil reserves any way he saw fit. Fall had control over California Naval Reserve, number 1, Elk Hill, number 2 in Buena Vista, the Wyoming Teapot Dome Naval Oil Reserve. Fall wasted no time in lining his own pocket at the taxpayers' expense. Of course, that's what all corrupt politicians do. Anyways, in November of 1921, Falls received a no-interest loan of $100,000 from Doheny. Now, here's the thing. When most people get a loan, there are papers to sign about interest rates, payment schedules. Back then, it was done in a bank where you signed the papers and the bank issued you a check. No, it wasn't done that way. Here's what happened. How did Falls actually get that loan? Did he sign a promissory note? No, of course not. Promissory note meant the paper trail. Corrupt politicians hate paper trails. So how did Falls get this loan? Well, Doheny, listen to this, instructed his son to withdraw $100,000 in cash from the son's bank account. Then place it in a black bag, yeah, a black bag, deliver it to Falls at his Washington, D.C. apartment. Now, maybe it's just me, or does this sound like plausible deniability? Yeah, it sure as heck sounds like quid pro quo, as they say. It was recorded later that Falls sat there and counted out every single dollar to make sure he wasn't being cheated. So, what did Doheny get for this alleged bribe? Doheny's company now had exclusive rights to the California oil reserves, and in return, American Petroleum and Transport Company was required to build storage tanks at Pearl Harbor, fill the tanks with crude oil, erect a refinery in California, and build a pipeline from the Naval Reserve to the refineries. And Doheny had to pay a royalty on the oil he extracted from the Naval Reserve. Now, the royalty Doheny was required to pay was absurdly low. Like any good corrupt politician, and Fall was the poster boy for corruption, you repeat the scam over again because it worked. Now, 1 month later, Fall, while at his New Mexico ranch celebrating Christmas, he received a telegram from Sinclair's lawyer asking for a meeting to discuss a very urgent and important matter. Fall invited Sinclair and his attorney to visit him at his New Mexico ranch. Now, for the next 3 days, from December 31st, 1921 to January 2nd, 1922, Fall, Sinclair, and his attorney hunted deer, quail, and wild turkey during the day and negotiated the leasing of Teapot Dome at night. The final deal gave Sinclair and his company, Mammoth Oil, exclusive rights to extract the oil and gas from Teapot Dome Reserve for 20 years. Now, the lease was signed on April 7th, 1922. The following month, in the Washington, D.C. rail yard, on board Sinclair's private rail car, Fall's son-in-law, M.T. Everhart, collected $198,000 in Liberty bonds and another $35,000 in bonds, as well as a personal loan in the amount of $36,000 in cash. Fall took a combined total of $369,000 in bribes. Now, adjusting for inflation, that would be worth $6,485,588.06 in 1922. Now, he enriched himself at the expense of the American taxpayer. Fall didn't care. He felt he deserved the money. Good corrupt politician, right? Yeah, okay. But the Secretary of the Interior in 1922 has a salary of $221,400. Adjusting that for inflation, that worked out to be about approximately $13,738 in 1922. Fall wasn't skimming a little off the top of the public trough. He had his snout buried deep down in it. But it was okay. He was looking out for the American taxpayer. Now, as bribery schemes go, Fall had to be considered one of the top scam artists of all times, but his arrogance was his downfall. What Secretary of the Interior Albert B. Fall didn't consider was the reaction of the other oil barons who were frozen out of the deal. Now, the leases were announced to the public in early April 1922. The Casper Daily Tribune's April 14, 1922 edition ran the story under the title, U.S. to Drill Oil Reserves. Store crude. Secretary of the Navy Denby and Secretary of Interior Falls stated jointly that they had become convinced that the government's reserve wells could not be depended on because of the extent to which private boring in the reserve district had drained off the underground supply. Hey, sounds plausible, right? The arrogance of Secretary Fall was stunning. In essence, he justified the oil leases because it was in the best interest of the American people. So don't question it. How dare you, right? Shortly after the leases were signed, the fallout began. Independent small drilling companies started to see drilling equipment bearing the name of Mammoth Oil setting up at Teapot Dome. Now, their complaints and the complaints and embarrassing questions from other oil barons about why there wasn't a competitive bidding process were causing questions to be asked in Congress. Now, within days of the lease deal's announcement, the public uproar was deafening. Congress had to act. Casper Daily Tribune, April 20th, 1922, front page headlines read, Republicans to join in demand for details of contract. The following day, the Casper Daily Tribune reported oil leasing data asked. Senator La Follette offered resolutions in the Senate, and he submitted letters from former Secretary of the Navy, Joseph Daniels, quoting the policy under his watch when he was in the Wilson administration. On April 28, 1922, Senator La Follette placed Senate Res. 282 on the floor of the Senate. That the Secretary of the Interior is directed to send to the Senate A. Copies of all oil leases made by the Department of the Interior within Naval Oil Reserve numbered 1 and separately Naval Oil Reserves numbered 2, both in the amount of the rent, royalties, bonuses, and all other compensations paid and to be paid to the United States. B. All executive orders and other papers in the files of the Department of the Interior and its bureaus or copies thereof, if originals are not in the files, authorizing or regulating such leases, including correspondence or memorandum embodying and concerning all agreements, instructions, and requests by the President or the Navy Department as to the making of such leases and the terms thereof. C. All correspondence, papers, files showing concerning the application for such leases and the actions of the Department of the Interior and its bureau thereon, and upon all the several claims upon which such leases were based or issued, all in said naval reserves. Resolved further that the Committee on Public Lands and Surveys be authorized to investigate the entire subject of leases upon naval oil reserves with particular reference to the protection of rights and equities of the government of the United States and the preservation of its natural resources, and to report its findings and recommendations to the Senate. Senator Fall did comply with this request as if he had nothing to lose. In fact, he flooded the committee with papers, making it impossible to find out what was going on. But he covered himself with a 69-page explanation letter. Now, the June 9, 1922 New York Herald reported the contents of the letter sent with all the documents and reprinted Harding's letter in support of Fall's action. In the last paragraph of President Harding's letter, he gives his full support of the leasing deal and his full support of Secretary Falls. He stated, I think it is only fair to say in this connection that the policy which has been adopted by the Secretary of the Navy and the Secretary of the Interior in dealing with these matters submitted to me prior to the adoption thereof, and the policy decided upon and the subsequent acts have at all times had my entire approval. By August 2nd, 1922, the line had been drawn between the administration and the Senate investigation. The Casper Daily Tribune ran a political cartoon indicating labor supported the deal and that the investigation was just about making the administration look bad. Now, behind the scenes, information was coming to light that the oil lease deal was not in the best interest of the country. Senator Robert M. La Follette of Wisconsin led an investigation by the Senate Committee on Public Lands. At first, La Follette believed Fall was innocent. However, his suspicions were aroused after his own office in the Senate office building was ransacked. Didn't they do that just recently? I don't know. Not going to get into it. Now, for 2 years, Democratic Senator Thomas J. Walsh of Montana led an investigation into the oil lease deal. Walsh diligently worked through the truckload of papers Fall had dumped on the Senate. While Senator Walsh was investigating, Falls was covering his tracks. Now, since Fall drew up the leases on the surface, they appeared legitimate and perfectly legal. He even refused to have the Attorney General get involved because he said, I practice law, I know what I'm doing, we don't need his opinion. Now, he knew what records had to go missing in order to cover up his tracks. Now, by March of 23, he figured he had cleared up any loose ends. On March 4th of 1923, Albert B. Fall resigned as Secretary of the Interior. There was just one problem. Fall had suddenly come into money which he used to pay off his back taxes on his ranch and to make improvements to his cattle breeding stock. He couldn't satisfactorily account for the windfall, and that's the problem with corrupt politicians. They're not thinking ahead. He spent the money, and now it was obvious, so he was in trouble. And as Walsh uncovered more and more evidence, it became clear that a full-blown investigation was in order. On October 15, 1923, the Senate Committee on Public Lands and Surveys opened their investigation. Now, by December 27th of 23, Fall was in trouble. He sent a statement to the committee detailing where he got the $100,000 loan. The Washington Evening Star on December 27th of 23 read, Fall says McLean lent him $100,000 for the ranch deal. The sub-headline stated, Sinclair again refuses to give data on naval oil leases in Wyoming. Yeah, it's starting to come apart and Falls doesn't know what to do. By January 24, 1924, the tide was turning against Albert Fall. The headlines for that day of the 1924 edition of the Indianapolis Times screamed, Doheny admits $100,000 loan. In the article, Doheny stated the loan was purely personal. By January 25th, the issue of the Washington, D.C. Evening Times ran a story on the other oil baron, Henry F. Sinclair. The headline read, Sinclair barricades himself in Paris hotel, silent on oil deal. Yeah, the rats are deserting the sinking ship at this point. Fall realized it was only a matter of time before everything came out in the open. Falls was getting desperate. So he decided to use the old ruse of being too sick to testify before the committee. The headlines in the January 30th, 1904 issue of the Evening Star read, Fall at breaking point. 4 doctors testify in Probe's committee, flatly told former secretary too ill to appear before it. Miraculously, by February 2nd, though, 1924, Falls was in better health and appeared before the committee, and basically he took the fifth. He refused to answer any questions. Now that day's headlines in the Evening Star read, Fall flatly refuses to answer questions of the Senate probe. By February 7th, the Senate Investigating Committee dropped its plans to force Fall to testify. Now ironically, in June 30th, 1924, a criminal indictment was filed in the District of Columbia charging Albert B. Fall and Henry F. Sinclair with conspiracy to defraud the United States. That trial began on October 17th of 1927 and ended prematurely 2 weeks later when the government presented evidence that Sinclair had hired a detective agency to shadow the jury. The judge declared a mistrial. Sinclair was tried for criminal contempt of court and more than 100 witnesses were called. The trial judge found Sinclair and his associates guilty. Sinclair was sentenced to 6 months in prison. He should have gotten longer. Alright, now ironically, Albert Falls was never convicted of the charge of defrauding the U.S. government. He was tried and convicted on bribery charges, which he appealed to the Washington, D.C. Court of Appeals. Now, on April 6, 1931, the appeals court upheld his conviction. Falls began serving his 1-year prison sentence on July 20th, 1931, 8 years after he resigned his post amid allegations of fraud and bribery. The first member of a president's cabinet to be convicted and sentenced to prison. Now, after leaving prison, Falls was financially ruined. But to add insult to injury, Doheny's corporation foreclosed on Falls Ranch in Tularosa Basin, New Mexico because of unpaid loans, which turned out to be the same bribe. Now, the other oil baron in this slimy deal, Sinclair, was fined and served 6 months for his contempt of court. Fall and his wife lived out their days in El Paso, Texas, where he died on November 30th, 1944, after long illness. So, what have we learned from this bit of history? Well, remember the phrase, follow the money. Sooner or later, the money trail leads back to the top. Now, if you ever find yourself in a position of power, just remember the American people are not that stupid. You're not untouchable, and you will be caught sooner or later. Greed and arrogance will always cause your downfall. Plausible deniability legally might work with spin doctors, but the American people can see through that nonsense. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. Now, if you did, hit the like button and please subscribe to my channel. Plus, ring that bell so you'll be notified when I post new content. As always, thank you for watching.